So welcome to our first discussion of the Spring Framework and Spring Boot. So references, the Spring Docs, framework overall overview, and the Wikipedia page on Spring. So Spring is an enterprise framework for developing complex Java applications. It really arose as an answer to the growing complexity of Java EE, which was the platform for this since the 90s. The Spring came about in the early 2000s. So Java EE getting more and more complicated. It started out complicated and it got more and more complicated as it went. Spring came out and it was much easier. It was working in the same space. It started taking over really. So Java EE, the team, basically it's open source, responded by making Java EE more like Spring. Meanwhile, Spring uses components designed for Java EE. So there's a discussion like Java EE and Spring are completely different. They're not. Spring uses components and concepts from Java EE, and Java EE, in the next release of it, they stripped away a lot of their complexity and completely redid it, looking more like Spring. So Spring and Java EE are alternative enterprise frameworks, but they do share a lot of code and concepts. So the Spring framework is divided into modules, so applications can choose which modules they need. At the heart of the modules is the core container, including a configuration model and a dependency injection mechanism. Dependency injection is really a core concept that's central to this. In dependency injection, the framework controls the lifetime of your objects. You create and design classes that conform to the framework, and then the framework takes control. So dependency injection frameworks are also called inversion of control containers. In our first example of Spring, well, you'll see dependency injection right away, and the best way to understand it is through an example. So the Spring Framework problem. At the start of a Spring project, you must make a lot of choices. You're developing what's essentially a complex application running in a complex environment. So these choices are natural. There's something called the Maven archetype. And then there's dependencies. What libraries are you going to use to build your applications? Then there's the versions of those libraries, and those libraries have interactive version compatibility. So you install a library, and it installs in turn all the other open source projects and libraries that it used. So every library you install has a stack of technologies that it installs, and sometimes the versions of those in those technologies are not intercompatible. So that's a problem. So then you have to configure your libraries as well. So there's dependency configuration. And then finally, the server choice and configurations. There's application servers that we'll use and we'll see that you'll have to make choices of and configure. So that's a problem for a beginner. And that's what Spring Boot is meant to answer. Spring Boot is a Spring module that takes these configuration and dependencies tasks out of the developer's hands. So the developer decides on the top level modules the application will use, and we'll see this. And then Spring Boot does everything else. It chooses the code libraries needed for those modules, for their high-level functionality, their versions. So version control problem is eliminated by using Spring. And it does the module configuration, a lot of it. And finally, it makes deployment of your application a lot easier. So Spring Boot is a great way to get into Spring, and we can see we'll start quickly developing applications in the next lecture. Thank you.